get the, there we go. I've got it now. Well, good morning, everyone. So good to be here with you. It's been a long time. It's good to see all of you. I was thinking here just a little bit ago when the first time I came up to this area of the country, it was in 1981. It would have been fall of 1981 that we first came into this part of our country. I think it was with the Clintwood Church where Brother Shirley Mullins was. And then shortly after, I began to be able to come to some of the other churches here. I don't remember when I held the first meeting here. I think it would have probably been when Brother Leonard Salyers was here so many years ago. But you start counting those, and that's quite a few years ago, isn't it? And so it's just a joy to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation to come back. I know that you had Jared here just a little bit early, Brother Jared McCrary. He's one of the finest young men that I've ever had the privilege of knowing, and it certainly is wonderful to have him as a co-laborer with the South Coleman Church. It enables me to be gone as often and as much as I need to be gone, and to do some other things that I need to do as one of the shepherds in the church there. And so it's just been a wonderful joy to have him there with us too. Got a young man working with us also, Jacob Black. He is somewhat of an intern. He's learning the ropes of preaching. And he's been with us about a year and going to be with us about another year. And so he'll be looking for a place to land here pretty quickly as we send him out into the world to preach the gospel. But again, it's so good to be here with you and with all of you that I've known for so many years. Thank you again for the invitation to be here. Learning to be an effective preacher or teacher is a lifelong pursuit. And one thing that makes the process so challenging is that the most effective approach to teaching and preaching depends a lot upon your context. Of course, within the realm of divine truth, your method and your manner is determined by who you're trying to teach and to some degree where you're trying to teach them. Being an effective teacher then often depends upon your ability to be able to read the room. Or to put another way, if you want to be effective, you've got to know something about your audience. You've got to know who it is that you're talking to. Now, Jesus was the teacher's teacher. He was indeed the master teacher. No one ever better understood his audience than he who knew the hearts of all man. But he knew who among his audience was hard-hearted and wouldn't listen to what he had to say. As he talked to people, he knew when men wanted to hear and maybe even obey, but then they would quickly turn away. He also knew when there were people who were listening who were just too busy really to do what he asked them to do, had too many thorns growing in their lives. But he knew it even as he spoke those words because, as I said, he knew the hearts of all men. But he also knew that there were listeners who were really starving for something better than what they heard every day from their Jewish rabbis. And these were people who would hang on every word and who would be willing to be transformed by the things that he taught them. Now, unlike Jesus, we're obviously limited in our ability to be able to know our audience, but still at the same time, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to teach and preach as best we can. We've got to understand the truth. So that means you've got to study the truth and you've got to come to know what it is that you're teaching, because you can't teach something to someone else that you do not know yourself. You've got to know the material yourself. More than that, you've got to learn to apply the truth. There comes a time when the rubber of theology has to meet the road of life. In other words, every single day we've got to take what we learn and put it into practice in our lives so that tomorrow we'll be better people. And then, especially if you're talking about a teacher, we've got to be able to convey that truth. We want to be able to convey it in the most effective way possible. Now, Jesus' teaching took various forms. There were times when he addressed people publicly. He used public discourse, such as the Sermon on the Mount. That's recorded for us in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And there were other times when Jesus spoke publicly so that all who were present could hear his voice and hear his teaching. There were other times, such as in John chapter 4, when Jesus spoke to the woman at the well in private conversation. Not only did he speak publicly, but sometimes he talked one-on-one to different people in different circumstances. You'll remember that Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, and Jesus had some things that he needed to say to him, and he taught him there in a very private way. One of the most prominent forms of teaching that Jesus did involved parables. Some have estimated that over a third of the things that Jesus taught was done in the form of parables. And depending upon your method of counting, there are somewhere between 30 and 60 parables. And most people, I think, kind of put that number at around 40 different parables that Jesus taught. But the number of the parables that he taught is not nearly so important as understanding what they were and why Jesus used them, and especially the lessons that they teach. So, in this first lesson this morning, we're going to talk all morning about parables, but in this first lesson, what we're going to do is just kind of introduce the parables to us. Let's first of all begin by defining the word parable, because that's important for us to do. It's important before we begin any subject to talk about the definition of the words that we're going to be using so that we'll all be on the same page. The word parable comes from two Greek words, which means literally to place alongside or to throw beside. The origin of the word refers to a comparison that's drawn between some commonplace reality and then a profound spiritual truth. It's this comparison that is the most distinctive form of Jesus' teaching in parables, not the plot, not the length, not the form, but just the simple illustration that Jesus is making of an important truth. Others have described parables as an earthly story to reflect a heavenly meaning, or the use of the known to explain the unknown, or familiar examples that lead men's minds toward heavenly concepts, things like that. John MacArthur said this. He said, "The symbolism in Jesus' parables is never thickly layered and rarely even multidimensional. In most cases, the parables make one simple point." And to that I very much agree. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more as the lesson goes this morning. When you think about all of the parables, and we're kind of taking a bird's eye view of all the parables in this lesson. When you think about the parables, there are categories that the parables fall into that when you think about them, it's really readily seen. First of all, they are parables of the kingdom, parables that have to do with the church. Matthew chapter 13 is one of these places where Jesus is teaching a number of parables by the seashore. And in almost every one of them, if not every one of them, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. And so these are parables that have to do with the nature of the kingdom and some things that are true in the kingdom of our Lord. Then there are parables of loss and redemption. There are parables such as the parables in Luke 15. You read about the parable of the lost sheep. What man has 99 sheep safe in the fold, one out who is lost, he's going to go out and he's going to look for that one that is lost. In the parable of the lost coin, where a woman sweeps to find that lost coin and she finally finds it. And then there's, of course, the parable of the lost sons, both the prodigal son, which we're going to talk about in the third hour this morning, and also there is the parable, or what is said in the parable of the prodigal son. There's also the elder brother that you have to consider there. There are parables on prayer that Jesus taught that men ought to always pray. And so you find that parable, or one of those parables, in Luke chapter 18. And so Jesus used this form of teaching in order to stress the importance of prayer, the importance of persistent prayer, to make sure we get that point in our lives. There are parables of forgiveness and compassion. Peter's question, "Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him?" prompts a parable from Jesus. Peter had said, "Do I need to forgive him 7 times?" The Pharisees only taught that you needed to forgive only 3. So Peter went way beyond that and said, "Can I forgive a man 7 times?" Jesus said, "Forget about that. Do 7 times 70, which would be 490. People are not going to usually keep track of 490 times they're going to forgive any one individual person. So what he's talking about is limitless forgiveness there. You just don't ever consider any limit on forgiveness when someone turns to you and he comes to you, and then he teaches the parable of the unforgiving servant, which in and of itself is a very important parable. I believe I taught on that last Sunday morning at South Coleman. Again, very important to see these different parables. He asked the question one time, "Who is my neighbor?" He was asked that question. And then he proceeded from there to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan, to point out that you're a neighbor to anybody that you can have the opportunity to serve, and however you have the opportunity to serve them. There are parables of judgment on the nation of Israel, such as in Luke 20, verses 9 through 18. Through the years, I have overlooked that instead of being parables of the second coming and parables of the final judgment, Jesus taught these parables that had to do with the nation, destruction of the nation of Israel. And when he taught those parables, people came to realize that he was talking about them and what was going to happen to them, and they needed to see that. And so there were these parables that are categorized there. Then, of course, there are those parables that have to do with the end times, parables that have to do with the second coming. You think about the 10 virgins. You think about the parable of the talents and the sheep and the goat. All of these found in Matthew chapter 25. So when you get to thinking about the parables and looking at them, just kind of overviewing them, you see these different categories of parables that indeed help us to be able actually to understand each and every one of them. But as you think about the parables continuing to do that, there's some characteristics of these parables that really stand out when you think about Jesus' most often used method of teaching. First of all, they were short for the most part. The parable of the fig tree is less than a verse long and contains only 18 words. So it's that short. Now, the story of the prodigal son is the longest of these parables and has only 525 words and 22 verses and occupies less than a page in my Bible. So although it may be one of the longest parable, it's still really relatively short when it comes to other things that Jesus would say. These stories, these characters and actions are whittled down to the barest essentials. And these characters do and say only what is needed. So there's rarely any superfluous details. Jesus wants to make a parable, or Jesus wants to make a point, and he illustrates it with a very short story. These parables were also vivid, or you might say they're picturesque. Jesus painted memorable word pictures in these parables, something that would stick in people's minds. Sometimes they were, maybe comical even. The unjust judge being pestered by a not-to-be-denied widow. You see that as almost funny. The guests at the dinner table climbing over each other to get to the very best seat, trying to get there first. It just seems almost foolish when you see how sometimes people behave, but Jesus made a point of it. Sometimes Jesus' parables were touching. The parable of the prodigal son, as we'll see here in just a little bit, it was a very touching story, very emotional story. Sometimes there are parables that even induce anger. Do you remember the unmerciful servant? Here he is, forgiven just more money than we can imagine. And then he has a fellow under him who still has a significant debt. But he should have forgiven him, but he didn't. And the Lord was so angry with him. And we can get caught up in that story and find ourselves having blood pressure rising too, especially when we see that taking place in our lives. We see somebody who's not willing to forgive other people. There are some of Jesus' parables that actually induce sympathy. You think about the parable of the tax collector, the publican, and the Pharisee. No one would have ever thought about sympathizing with that tax collector, with that publican. But by the time the story is true, he's the one we're thinking about. He's the one that is humble. He's the one that is accepted before God. We've got sympathy for him and the way the Pharisee is treating him. Some of the other parables actually created respect. I'm thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan here, because no one respected a Good Samaritan during the days of Jesus, hardly. But after the story is over, we're thinking, hey, this is a good man. And so all of these have created pictures that are impossible for us to forget. They are stamped upon our memories, and those of us who've been Christians all our lives will never forget the details of these stories. But despite their brevity, Jesus sometimes even further embellished the story by his language. Think about this from the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus did not say the younger son suffered hunger in a foreign language. That's the quick way of saying it, right? He said he would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating and no one gave unto him. You see how the embellished language actually brings out the flavor of the story? The man who has invited his acquaintances to a great banquet after they've all made their excuses doesn't say to the servant, go into the city and bring in the poor. Instead, what he says, you go out into the streets and the lanes of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and you bring in the lame. And so he embellishes the story by the way that he explains it. Again, all of this is to present these things very vividly, very picturesque in our minds so that we will not forget them. At the same time, they were earthly. The parables are not like the bizarre and bone-jarring prophecies of Ezekiel. They're not like the endless and obscure genealogies of Chronicles. They're not like the mind-numbing, coma-inducing census data of Numbers. They're not talking about the blood of Leviticus or the complex arguments of Romans and Hebrews. Rather, Jesus borrowed pictures from everyday life. He talked about pictures from home life. He talked about pictures from nature and from the animal world and from agriculture and from commerce and from hospitality and from royalty. These are the things that Jesus used. These are the things that he wanted us to understand and know so that he could make his point. But at the same time, they were also heavenly in their being. The breadth of the imagery, the human content, the parables are always God-oriented. And ultimately they speak of God reigning over His kingdom, God reigning over His people. In kingdom terms, we're ruled by God, a God-king who is just and patient and loving and gracious and merciful and wrathful and generous and exacting and methodical and surprising. All of these things are characteristic of God as they are presented in the parable. But again, God is the center of these parables. They're very wide-ranging. The breadth of the imagery in these parables are just staggering. They employ a wide variety of locations, from a farm field, think parable of the sower, to houses, and then to seas, and to marketplaces, and to gardens, and to vineyards. They employ a wide range of characters, whether it be a farmer, a fisherman, a merchant, or a Samaritan, or priest, or Levite, or neighbors, or host, or guest, or Pharisees, or tax collectors. There's just a wide range of characters. And all of these characters and all of these places are put in unusual circumstances. Planting seed, working in a vineyard, hiring employees, settling accounts. There's just such a wide-ranging variety of topics here that really impress us. But even though that is the case, they are very, very simple in their message. Virtually all of the parables have 3 or fewer main characters or main groups of characters. Many of them involve only 1 or 2. Most of the parables have only 1 scene to them. A few might have 2, and there's 1 or 2 that may have a 3rd scene, but most of them are really simple 1 scene things. And in any given scene, only 2 people are going to speak at any one time. Even if a group of people are present, only 2 are going to speak. So again, that speaks to the simplicity of the parables themselves. There may be things you may not understand about Romans 7 and 8. There are things I don't understand about Romans 7 and 8. The book of Revelation sometimes may dizzy you in your studying of it, but never Jesus' parables. Never. Because they are so simple. And they have such plain things. Now, they are also structured. The plot is always simple with a very few extraneous details. Now, what I want to say in this point, I sometimes have to work to grasp any spiritual significance to it. But the truth of the matter is, it happens so often that it can't be overlooked when you're studying the parables. It just jumps off the page at you. I'm a person who, when I study a book, the first thing I want to do when I look at any book is I want to see the structure of that book. I want to see how it's put together. I want to outline it. I want to see the introduction. I want to see the conclusion. I want to see the different points that the writer's wanting to make. I'm wanting to see the overall structure, and then when I can see that, I'm better able to determine what the trees look like when I understand what the forest pictures, right? That's what you need to be able to see. Parables are a lot that way when you look for the structure that is in the parables. For example, in many parables, the number 3 is significant. There are 3 bad soils. There are 3 groups of messengers. There are 3 servants. There are 3 scenes. There are 3 excuses. There are 3 actions. You can't overlook that. They're there. And many parables feature a 3+1 structure. In the parable of the sower, for example, there are 3 bad soils and 1 good soil, right? And there are, in the parable of the wicked tenants, 3 emissaries sent, and then there is the son. So you got 3+1. In Luke 15, there are 3 things that are lost: the sheep, the corn, and the son. Plus, you've got the older brother as kind of a throw-in lesson at the end. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, there are 3 who are indifferent to the victim, but then there is the Samaritan himself. Okay? And so that's just so often there that you cannot overlook it. Now, if I'm going to explain why do we see that, the only thing I can say is that it contributes to the fullness of the story. That if any one of these 3 were not present in the study, then the story might not be complete enough for Jesus to get across his point to us. And so all 3 of these there is going to present to us the fullness of the story, and kind of the one that's added at the end is going to bring the conclusion to the thing. You think about the wayside soil, you think about the rocky soil, you think about the thorny soil, but then what's going to bring us the lesson? It's going to be the good soil. That's what we're going to come to the conclusion of. That's what's going to. That's how we're going to see and end up with the parable of the soils, or the parable of the sower. So that structure is there, and that's the only way that I know how to actually explain that structure. When we think about these parables, we'll also notice that they were very engaging. Jesus used parables to draw his audience into his story, and sometimes unsuspectingly. Fred Craddock said this, and I think it's really interesting. He said, the parables of Jesus were told to be overheard. Now think about that just a minute. Here's Jesus, the speaker of the parable. Here are the people, his disciples, that he's presenting the parable to most often. And then there are people that are around that are just kind of overhearing the story. Okay? Now I want you to think about that third group for a minute. Craddock went on to say, there was a certain man. That's anonymous. He's speaking in past tense, and he's talking about somebody somewhere else. And so the person who's overhearing is thinking, there's nothing here addressed to me, right? So I'm just going to relax and enjoy the story. I'm going to see what this itinerant preacher from Nazareth is going to say. And then it happens. I'm inside the story. I'm one of the characters, and the door closes behind me. I'm there, and there's something I've got to apply. I've got to hear. And that just makes these stories so powerful. Jesus used contrast often to create interest in his hearer. There's the day laborer versus the wholesale merchant. There's the big debtor versus the little debtor. The younger son versus the elder son. The judge versus the widow. The rich invited guest versus the street people. The 5 wise virgins, we're going to talk about them in just a minute, and the 5 foolish virgins. Wedding and a funeral. All this contrast. And in some cases, Jesus created an interest by even asking an engaging question. For example, in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 9, or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? And anyone who listens to this is going to say, what's this man going to say? Or what about which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he comes in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? That's unusual. Normally, the master would eat first and the slaves would eat later, but now he's got these people coming in from the field and then just going right straight to the dinner table. Who's going to do that? And so, all of a sudden, you're listening to what Jesus wants you to hear. The point I'm wanting to make again is that these stories engaged people. I don't think it's really any different today. I think preachers have to be careful about telling stories, because the truth of the matter is sometimes the stories that we tell today are more about the story than they are about the point that they make. That wasn't true with Jesus. Jesus told a story for a point. He wanted people to be able to get his point, okay? I think it's really good to be able to tell a good story that's going to have a point to it. Because when you got that point, you've engaged people, their minds are thinking with you, and then you can, at that point, make your point and have it made successfully. And if you think about all of these parables, they were also very surprising. And in some cases, there's a reversal of fortune in the story, often at the very end. Not in every parable, but certainly in several of them. For example, the tax collector and the publican, the Pharisee and the publican. Just to illustrate it, when in that day, when people thought about righteous people, you know who they thought about? First people that came to their mind were the Pharisees. Because they were, to the common man that day, paragons of virtue. They were the ultimate of the spiritually minded according to the thought of the common man. And so here you are, you're thinking, when you hear about the Pharisee standing up and praying, and he's bragging to God about who he is, you're thinking about, well, he's just telling the truth. This is who he is. But then you hear about this publican praying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, as he beat upon his breast. But then Jesus said, which of these do you think is going to be received? It's not going to be the arrogant Pharisee. It's going to be this tax collector. Reversal of fortune, you see. When you think about the parable of the prodigal son, the prodigal, he's wasted his father's substance on riotous living, prostitutes, and all of that. And you think, the elder brother's been there and he's been faithful all day long, and you think he's the one that is really the one who's been with his father. He's the one that is the best in this story, but not so. Again, you have that reversal of fortune. In some cases, there are surprising features. I think the amount of growth by the good seed in the parable of the soils is just astronomical when you get to thinking about it. The amount of debt owed by a single servant. In that parable of the unforgiving servant, the amount of debt that unforgiving servant had was just more than me and you can possibly imagine. And on the other hand, the amount that the lesser man owed, the man who should have been forgiven, that was a very significant debt in and of itself. It wasn't just some paltry sum. It was a very significant debt. But still, it's surprising. The extreme punishment of a lazy worker like the one-talent man. Throw him in to the outer darkness where there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It seems so abrupt and so hard. The equal pay to all the workers, from the least productive to the most. Where you have them men being called to serve, and they were called in the first hour of the day, and then there are those who are called in the last hour of the day, the 11th hour, getting the same reward. For some of us, that doesn't seem fair. But to Jesus, it was what it was. It is really a surprising element in the story, but it is what it is. And then finally, I want to suggest to you that they were authoritative. In the parables, Jesus spoke of his authority. He declared that his audience response to his words had eternal implications. Matthew 7, 24 through 27, the parable of the two builders. We're talking about important eternal implications. He would return in glory to separate the wheat from the tares. He would return in glory. He described himself as the vineyard owner's son who is rejected and killed the tenants, leading to their judgment. They're going to be judged. He described himself as a king's son whose wedding feast is ignored by the invitees, resulting in their destruction, and further invitations given to the outcast. In these parables, the authority of God, the Father, is central and significant, presented plainly. He commands his servant as he wishes and expects his children to obey without a doubt. So that brings us then to the question that I raised on my very first slide, and which serves as the title of this lesson. Why did Jesus use these parables? Why did he teach in such a way so much of the time? Well, I'll offer to you several different answers to this question. First of all, Jesus used these parables to explain the kingdom and kingdom behavior to his disciples. Again, we go back to Matthew chapter 13. In verse 11, Jesus answered them, "It has been granted to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God." And he's teaching these to them in parables. For example, in verse 24, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. We're talking about the kingdom. We're talking about sowers. In verse 31, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed which a man took and sowed in his field. And then, it grew exponentially. In verse 31, verse 33, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It may not be seen, but it's there to influence so very much. In verse 34, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid again, and from joy over it he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. It illustrates the truth that Solomon said so many years ago, you buy the truth and sell it not. You buy it, you pay whatever price you have to pay for it, and then you don't let it go for any reason whatsoever. The kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea, gathering fish of every kind, and they're going to be separated. So Jesus taught these parables in order to be able to explain the kingdom and to explain kingdom behavior to his disciples. He also taught these parables to conceal the truth from those whose hearts were dishonest and whose hearts were hard. Listen very carefully to this. In Matthew 13, verse 11, Jesus said, "To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted." Now, the them in this passage, they're identified in chapter 12 of Matthew. You study Matthew chapter 12, there is no break. Chapter 13 begins with that day Jesus went out, and then he's teaching these. And so he's making a contrast between those wicked people and the wicked way they had treated him with the message that he has for them here. And then in verse 13 of the text, he says, "Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." Verse 14 says, "In their case the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you will keep on hearing but will not understand, you will keep on seeing but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, with their ears they scarcely hear, and they've closed their eyes, and otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand them with their heart, and return, and I would heal them." Now, consider this. These people, these wicked people that Jesus are talking about, they could not understand Jesus' parables. But it wasn't because his language was so far above their heads that they were incomprehensible. In fact, there were others, common people, who heard him gladly and understood the point that he was making with these very parables. Jesus' message in the parables was only hidden from them in the sense that they had so hardened their hearts and closed their eyes that they should not see and understand. It wasn't Jesus' purpose to keep it hidden from them. He wanted to reveal. But it was their hearts that kept it hidden. It was their hearts that kept them from seeing. Now, there is another statement that needs to be considered here. What did Jesus mean when he claimed that he did not speak to them without a parable? Because we know that Jesus spoke before these parables by the sea in a very direct way. And we also know that after this, he spoke in very direct teaching. So I take it, I think the only way we can take it is that statement is being made in a specific context and does not refer to Jesus' teachings in other places and at other times in different circumstances. And so this method of teaching that Jesus used is itself a matter or subject of prophecy. Asaph said in Psalm 78 in verse 2, "I will open my mouth in a parable, I will utter dark sayings from old." Jesus was fulfilling what Asaph said. And this specifically seems to be relating to matters surrounding the coming kingdom and the nature of it, and is connected with Isaiah's prophecy that Jesus quotes here in this text, and why Jesus spoke in the parables in the first place. So why did Jesus speak in parables? It was going to conceal the truth from those who did not and could not understand it because of their own hardness of heart. but it was going to be able to reveal the truth to those who were open heart. He wanted to incite interest in his hearers. Simplicity is one of the first rules of teaching, and illustrations and stories make things simple. It makes it where people can understand it. The parables are simple. They are interesting. Mark made an observation on one occasion in Mark 12, verse 37. The large crowd enjoyed listening to him. They enjoyed listening to them. The fact that he used these stories, I think, is one of the reasons they enjoyed listening to him. And it also helped people to remember. You know, lengthy text and deep theological concepts are not only hard to understand sometimes, but they are more difficult to remember. But simple stories, especially that are very common, will stay in the mind. When you take a simple story and then you make a very important spiritual lesson from it, that's going to stick in your mind and never go. And then, of course, he spoke these parables in order to make a spiritual point, and that's the thought that we want to turn to next as we talk about how are we to interpret these parables. I want to remind you of the statement that I quoted in the beginning from John MacArthur, who said, "The symbolism in Jesus' parables is never thickly layered and rarely even multidimensional. In most cases, the parables make one simple point," and as I said, I agreed with it then, I agree with it now. Parables usually have one primary lesson that they're going to teach. One primary lesson. And the lesson can usually easily be determined by the context. For example, Jesus spoke the three parables of Luke 15 because those who were murmuring against him they murmured against him for receiving sinners. And we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. His main point was that God rejoices when sinners return. That's the main point of those parables. Even when others do not, God receives them back. Now, sometimes there are secondary lessons in parables. For example, the parable of the talents. The Lord's going to return. He will judge each of us based on how we have used our talents or our opportunities that He has given us. But there's also a secondary lesson here I think that's very important, and that is that all of us have been given different, more or less opportunities or talents by God, and all of them to be used in His service. There are not many one-talent men in this world, but those one-talent men are to use that one talent in a way that will glorify God. Right. Everybody has that responsibility to serve wherever he can serve. I would issue a warning here is that we must be careful not to press a parable too far. Trying to make every detail of a parable have some deep spiritual significance is a mistake, and it's bad exegesis, it's bad Bible study. For example, the oil and the wine that the Samaritan used to dress the unfortunate traveler in the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The oil and the wine were just that, they were oil and wine. But they symbolize nothing except the Samaritan's care. There is no greater, deeper spiritual significance. The Samaritan cared, and he showed it by what he did. Yeah. There is no deep significance to the pods that the swine were eating in the story of the prodigal son. That's just the circumstances that he found himself in. So while sometimes there's more than one point to a parable, let's never stretch the parable too far to try to make it teach something that it doesn't teach. For example, in the parable of the sower, there is no special significance to the point that only 1 in 4 hearers had good hearts. That's no evangelism formula for success or failure. We're not to say that 1 out of 4 people that we teach is going to have a good heart, or 3 out of every 4 people we teach is going to have a bad heart. It's reading way too much in the parable, never intended to make that point. So never stretch a figure of speech, never stretch a parable beyond its intended use. But one final thing, and then the lesson will be yours. In these parables, in all of Jesus' parables, there is an emphasis upon hearing. After Jesus had given the parable of the sower and explained why He used parables, Jesus asked His disciples, verse 13, Mark 4 and verse 13, do you understand the parable? How will you understand parables? I believe the answer to that question is bound up in how Jesus ended the parable itself, including in all 3 of the synoptics in the same fashion. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. That's right. Let him hear. The key to understanding all the parables absolutely depends upon whether or how we listen to what Jesus said. And Jesus made that very, very clear. My favorite definition of a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, some people in their study of these parables have thought that was some trite statement. I don't. I think that's exactly what a parable is. It's simple, but to those who long for the kingdom of God, it enriches to us these lessons. Very, very important to do that. So the key questions we should be asking ourselves is, how's our hearing, and with what kind of heart do we approach the parables? That's really important for us to know. Thank you for listening to me this morning. I hope these lessons will be of benefit to you. May God bless you as we continue our worship this morning.